Erica Harold, Executive Director, Commission on Professionalism. The future is now. Legal Services 2024.
It's now my privilege to turn the Future is Now stage over to the Commission's Deputy Director, Stephanie Villinski.
Thank you, Erica. As Justice Rochford said in her opening remarks today,
Stephanie Villinski, Deputy Director, Commission on Professionalism.
In our challenging careers, it's important that we take care of ourselves. But as we know, this isn't always easy in the legal profession. So today we're going to get insight on how to do this from two experts who study well-being and behavioral health in the legal profession. Patrick Krill is a lawyer, licensed, and board-certified addiction counselor and researcher who has led many of the legal profession's recent efforts to improve mental health. Bree Buchanan has held leadership roles at several organizations focused on lawyer well-being, including the Texas Lawyers Assistance Program, the ABA Commission on Lawyers Assistance Programs, and the International Bar Association's Professional Well-Being Commission. Welcome, Patrick and Bree. Thank you for being here.
Thank you, Stephanie.
Yeah, thank you.
So to get started, let's make sure we're working from the same definitions. When people discuss this topic, they use terms like well-being, mental health, work-life balance, etc. What terminology should we use today and why?
Bree Buchanan, Senior Advisor, Krill Strategies.
Yeah, I think one of the things that I almost sort of have a pet peeve about is the well-being versus wellness. And when the beginning of the whole well-being in law movement was the National Task Force on Lawyer Well-Being report that Patrick and I were both bringing that forward. And we were really intentional about talking about well-being rather than wellness. And the idea is that it just feels very much more specific to what we're talking about. And wellness kind of connotes a much broader idea, and it really gets into the sort of the yoga and the that sort of thing. And what we're trying to do, there's a much bigger umbrella and more targeted. I don't know, Patrick, what do you think?
Patrick Krill, Founder, Krill Strategies.
Yeah, I think it is important. Well, I'm glad you asked the question, Stephanie, because I think it is important for us all to be using the same or similar terminology. And we have a wide range of terminology that's currently being deployed on this topic. Bree, I think, is right. Well-being is a more appropriate term for this work that we're doing. It's holistic in nature in the sense that there are multiple dimensions of well-being. But comparing that to, for example, mental health, well-being is the broader term because mental health is a part of someone's well-being, just like physical health is a part of someone's well-being. There's another term that you probably hear sometimes called behavioral health, which is really speaking more to mental health and substance use disorders. So it's not necessarily talking about other aspects of well-being, right, like spiritual well-being. That would not be part of behavioral health. And in terms of work-life balance, I think we should just eject that term from the conversation completely because I'm not sure it really exists, but it's just, I think it's not a particularly helpful term.
No, thank you both. That's really, really helpful. And I agree on the work-life balance in this profession for sure. Patrick, you've done several research studies. What does your data tell us about the state of well-being in the legal profession?
Well, the bottom line up front is that it's not good. And we have many challenges that I think we need to take more seriously and to do more to address. But zooming out from the legal profession, I think it's important for us to kind of level set as to where we are as a society in 2024. We have poor levels of mental health throughout society. During the last several years, we saw levels of depression and anxiety and substance misuse and suicidality. All of those things spiked significantly throughout society as a part of many of the novel stressors that were emerging during the COVID pandemic era. And so it's important for all of us to recognize that we're just kind of living in a world where more people are struggling with their mental health, with their hazardous or risky substance use. But beyond that, once you kind of zoom back into the legal profession, we know that our challenges have historically outpaced what you see in the general population. I published a series of studies over the last couple of years that was based on data drawn from California and Washington, D.C., those two large bar associations. And what those studies collectively demonstrated was that the levels of mental health distress in the legal profession were also climbing among lawyers during the COVID era. We were turning to hazardous drinking really at alarming rates. And one thing that was surprising was that more women than men were drinking hazardously during the COVID pandemic. A lot of complicated reasons for why that is, but it's something that we need to be aware of. And so I would just say, to summarize, we are a profession that has high levels of mental health distress. You have many people kind of in a clinical realm, but you have also many people in sort of a subclinical realm where they're just not in a good place, but they're maybe not in distress. And we have a long-standing hazardous relationship with alcohol that we have not managed to make a lot of progress around, despite all of the efforts that Bree and I and many other people have been attempting to make.
Why do you think that is, in terms of what leads to the poor mental health and well-being in the profession?
Well, so we could spend 2 hours talking about
Sum
that.
that up, please.
It's a combination of factors, and I'm mindful of the fact that we have a diverse audience today, people from different practice settings and in different roles within the profession. And so I'm loath to generalize too much, right? Because people's work experiences and work environments may be different. However, I think what you could say across the board for just about everyone in this profession is that stress is a meaningful contributor to the mental health problems we have. But there are plenty of other stressful professions and occupations. So that in and of itself doesn't answer the question. I think it's the adversarial nature of the profession, the attitudes that we are taught that we need to adopt to be part of this profession, a lot of the messaging that we are receiving both implicitly and explicitly beginning in law school, right? Keep your problems to yourself. You're not supposed to have problems. You're supposed to be perfect, have all the answers. Those types of things really inhibit legal professionals from, forget about asking for help, from even looking at their own behaviors sometimes when they're kind of in that early problematic stage. And so it's really a combination of things. Yes, the high chronic stress, poor coping mechanisms that are culturally accepted, if not normalized and encouraged in response to that stress, and the way that we feel we have to comport or present or project ourselves as lawyers often is at odds with the type of person who's going to say, hey, I need a break, or I need to get some counseling, or can you help me? And when you take all of those things together, Bree, I'm sure has additional insights, but I think when you take all those things together and kind of mash them up, you just find yourself with a heightened risk profile.
Yeah. And I think one of the things I hear routinely is just simply the 24/7 on-call nature of the legal profession. The inability to have time for rest and rejuvenation, which is essential, particularly in a hard-driving profession like we have for ourselves. So that's no small piece of it. And we can talk later about some strategies around that. And I think just to dig in a little bit deeper, also what Patrick was saying around perfectionism and the expectations of always being perfect, or the belief in not being able to make mistakes. And so if you make even a little mistake, it just becomes intolerable. And that leads to a whole host of negative consequences. And it's even that sort of toxic perfectionism has been identified as a contributor to suicidality. So it's something to really be concerned about.
For sure. And so would you say the stress and just the lifestyle of the profession is really what is leading to kind of those maladaptive behaviors, or is it something more that, say, legal professionals have versus others?
Yeah, I think one of the pieces of that is, like we already started touching upon, who is attracted to this in the nature of the profession. So there that level of high chronic stress in a competitive field without ever feeling like you can make a mistake. Those are some of the things. But I also think, besides just the type of person, it also is the feelings and the negative and difficult things that we have to deal with over the course of a profession and engaging in maladaptive behaviors. And I think of that maladaptive behavior in lawyers often is self-medicating behavior to try and deal with and cover up things like depressive feelings, anxiety, a sense of isolation and loneliness, which actually causes a person to feel physical pain. And I've shared my own story quite a bit in the profession. And when I started at law school, I had imposter syndrome. I thought I was the one person who that didn't belong there. I got into litigation, and it was constant trauma, lots of trauma, doing domestic violence work and trying to figure out how to not bring that home, ultimately burnout. Over the course of that time, the go-to then and now really still, I think, is with alcohol and engaging in that. And that leads and opens the door to a lot of these behavioral health disorders, the substance use disorders and the depression, et cetera.
I think that's all exactly right. And what I would add to that, simply a couple of findings from those research studies that I was mentioning earlier. The one that was published in 2021, it was called Stress, Drink, Leave. And we focused on the drinking aspect in addition to attrition and gender differences. But we found that workplace permissiveness towards alcohol use, meaning the more permissive someone perceived their work environment to be towards alcohol use or encouraging of alcohol use, the more likely that person was themselves to have an alcohol use disorder. And so there's clearly a connection there. You can think of it as kind of peer influence, peer pressure, high normalization of that self-medication that Bree was talking about. One finding that it didn't make its way into the manuscript simply because it didn't fit within the scope of what we were looking at, but it's really important. We used a drinking motives questionnaire to examine why it is that lawyers say they drink, assuming they are someone who drinks. And the number one reason, far and away, was stress relief and relaxation. And that might not sound like that big of a deal on the surface, but it in fact is, because drinking motives are often tied to outcomes. And we know that when people drink as a form of stress relief, they're much more likely to ultimately develop a problematic relationship with alcohol compared to someone who, for example, drinks, to enhance a fun experience or to enhance a meal or for purely social reasons. And that's why most lawyers say they drink, almost always or most of the time, is to manage stress. And that's just setting us up for a much more hazardous use of alcohol.
Thank you. No, that makes sense. In terms of, people I think might be thinking, so then, we're in this stressful profession. What really are some realistic things that, lawyers can do and fit into their lives to improve their well-being? Bree, I think you're on mute.
I think we have to look at, and being really realistic, and you hinted at this in your question, Stephanie, is advising people, offering things that can actually be done by somebody who's already overwhelmed with things to do. I used to teach mindfulness, and it's kind of like trying to get somebody to go to the gym, and a few people will, and it has profound impacts. But it's hard to adopt and find the time and discipline to do that. So I like to talk about things that you can build into your day. And so one of the issues, there's such a degree of loneliness and isolation in the profession, which really causes a lot of behavioral health and physical problems. And so being very intentional about connecting with other people in positive situations. I tell folks, think of it as like medicine for yourself or preventive medicine, to really make sure that you're maintaining connections. A footnote to that is great. Maintaining connections outside the law would be really helpful too. I think looking for and scheduling joyful activities We know that that has a real ongoing boost to your sense of well-being. So figure out what it is that you really enjoy doing and make time, put it on your calendar to do that. And hopefully you can do that with somebody else. Patrick, some other things that you offer?
I agree with all of that. What I would add, however, and I think Bree's right. We have to, when we're talking about things that people can do to improve or protect their well-being, we have to take into account that many people don't have a lot of time to devote to that. But I don't think that we should simply kind of stop the inquiry there. I think people need to be willing to look at their own life and ask themselves some tough questions, right? Like, should I have a little bit more time for my mental health and well-being? And should I maybe be setting aside a little bit more time for me, my family, whatever it might be, and engage in a little bit of introspection? Because if we simply defer to the fact that I'm overwhelmed, that is putting yourself, on the back burner and acquiescing to that. And yes, sometimes the demands of the profession, the demands of your clients do require that, but we shouldn't accept that as the status quo all the time. So I do think people kind of need to look at their lives and say, why is it that I can't even find 30 minutes to go for a walk or to grab coffee with someone? And what can I do about that? But beyond that, I would really encourage people to explore the role of physical activity / exercise in their lives. There's been a lot of compelling research coming out over the last decade, including one very recent large meta-analysis showing how regular physical activity is just as helpful, and in some cases more helpful, at mitigating symptoms of depression and anxiety than prescription medication, right? And so obviously the medication is very quick. It's for some people very convenient, but it can also bring unwanted side effects. And, doing things like getting out for a regular walk or getting some exercise can pay huge dividends. And then when you are back at work, you find yourself more focused, more productive, more relaxed. And so you're ultimately getting more done because you took that bit of time somewhere in your day to take care of yourself.
Agree. And I would just say that I know Patrick practices what he preaches, because I know one day when we're coming on for our phone call to discuss this, he was coming from a workout. So I definitely can say he does do that. I wanted to go to a question from the audience that kind of goes a little bit off what you were just saying too, Patrick, from Pamela. So she's asking, whether, that there's a lot about people asking whether they should go to law school, and mostly they focus on, questions on the internet, focus on debt, job opportunity, but rarely does, anything or any article say how does the mental health issue factor into this. So what would you say to the next generation? I think that is a great question.
It absolutely is a great question. And I, when I was the Lawyers Assistance Program Director in Texas for 10 years, I went out and spoke to thousands of law students. And my message, my sort of soapbox message for them was that you're entering what I think of as like a hard hat zone for your emotional well-being. And you need to prepare for that. And just like you have to develop a core competency for civil procedure or evidence, that your self-care needs to be a core competency. And it's something that you need to plan for now in law school, and continue to attend to that over the course of your career. Your needs are going to shift over time, but that always has to be a part of practicing law, because, and what I tell them is, this should be a sustainable profession. You're putting so much into this. You should be able to stick with this profession until you are ready to retire, which for a lot of people is 40 years doing this. So how can you stay in that hazardous zone if you're not really doing something to fortify yourself?
Yeah, I agree with that. And I think taking care of oneself does need to be viewed as a core competency. It's a skill that you need to develop and commit to if you're going to be successful in this career over the long term for most people. But I really love this question because I think it draws out something that we do need to highlight, that the legal profession is getting a bad rap, and the image of the profession, I think, is being compromised by some of the mental health and well-being challenges that we face. We want to be attracting good people who are going to be out there serving the public, they're effective advocates, they're upholding the rule of law. It's really essential for those reasons, that we make some improvement here, so that a question like that wouldn't even need to be asked, because the work that is done by practitioners in this field it's essential to the proper functioning of society. And so we need to be attracting people. But I think the final thing I would say is that for anyone who's considering a career in the law, just be clear on why, right? And what you actually think it's going to look like for you. Because one thing that I hear about a lot from young associates in kind of the big law realm, especially, is it's like being splashed with cold water, right? It's just not what they thought it was going to be. And I think if we did a better job of communicating what the day-to-day life and stresses and nature of the profession looks like to people, they could be coming into it more with eyes wide open, and there would be less of that shock, which would probably translate into less mental health distress for younger attorneys.
Thank you. And thanks again, Pamela, for that question. And please keep asking us questions in the chat. I also wanted to talk a little bit about, and I don't think we talk about it enough, what should we look for in colleagues who may be struggling, whether it's somebody in our own office or someone we see in the courthouse. What should we look for, and then how can we assist those colleagues in need?
So the first thing I would say is that it depends on the context, right? So if you don't know someone and you don't really have a baseline read on them and what their normal is, it might be very difficult to detect if they are in distress, unless it's just obvious, right? They're showing up to court, you can smell the alcohol in their breath, or it's something that it would be very difficult to miss. So in those instances, sometimes people can fly under the radar, which is why it's important that we stay connected to people and we have a sense of who they are and what their typical presentation would look like. But to that point, assuming you do know the person, maybe it's someone you work with or you see on a regular basis, the number one thing I would encourage people to be thinking about is change, right? Has this person changed? Do they not seem like themselves? Is their behavior, is their mood, their attitude, is it a departure from that person I know or that person that I have historically observed? Maybe they're more angry, anxious, maybe they're more agitated, they're more moody, they're just off. Maybe it's clear that they're not taking care of themselves, right? That their self-care is slipping. And often people can be very reluctant to comment on or even observe someone's appearance, right? But that's a mistake when it comes to mental health or well-being, because someone could be deteriorating right in front of you and it's clear, like they look terrible, they look unwell and something's off. But I hear this in law firms a lot. People didn't want to say anything about how that person looked because there's a lot of sensitivity that attaches to that. But I think we need to be willing to acknowledge when someone is simply not appearing well. And then also, in addition to looking for changes in their behavior, their mood, what's their performance like? Is their performance slipping? Are they not the same reliable person that they used to be? Is their work product suffering? And there could be plenty of reasons why someone's work product is suffering that are not tied to an ongoing mental health or substance use problem. So you never want to jump to conclusions, but you also don't want to bury your head in the sand and pretend it's not happening, because often that is a signal that something's off. And the sooner we check in with the person, the sooner we ask them, hey, how are you doing? The greater the likelihood that that problem will be addressed while it's still in kind of an early stage and before too much damage has been done to that person or their career or potentially your clients.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of hesitancy to step into the void. I answered phone calls from distressed lawyers for 10 years, and it was always a little bit difficult. You're entering into a difficult space, so it takes some courage to do it. What I have advised, and this is best practice, if someone and like Patrick said, you can tell that they are off, don't ignore it. Go to them and ask them, give them the facts. I've noticed that you spend all your time in the office now or something, and that's not like you. And I'm really worried about you. How are you doing? Tell me what's going on. And it's not going to be unusual for them to say, oh, I'm fine. And then you ask it twice, so that you ask that question the second time. really, I really do want to know. I care how you're doing. And the idea for all of this is to get them to simply open up and talk. So your next job, which is really hard for lawyers, is to stop talking and just really listen to that person. And you're not necessarily there to even fix it. It's to give them an opportunity to get that out of their head and start thinking about moving into the next step towards some sort of supportive resources.
Yeah, it's such a great point, Bree, about the active listening piece, right? Because initiating the conversation, asking someone how they're doing, that's the essential first step. But then hear what they have to say, right? And for a lot of us, that is a challenge because we maybe just want to go on and keep talking or keep cross-examining them. And that would be a mistake. One thing that I just want to add, often people are reluctant to engage in these types of conversations because they don't know how, or it feels awkward to them, or they're just not good at that type of sort of personal, maybe potentially vulnerable communication. And for purposes of today's conversation, just to keep it really simple, I would say approach the conversation the way that you would want to be approached, right? And I think that's going to set you on the right path. Now, you might be saying, I wouldn't want someone approaching me about my mental health, but assuming that someone was seeing signs in you that were concerning them, how would you want them to approach you, right? Probably with some empathy, treating you with dignity and respect, not jumping to conclusions, those types of things, but kind of putting yourself in that person's shoes and approaching the conversation the way that you would want to be approached, I think is a good, really rough guidebook for having these types of conversations.
Thank you both. That's really practical. Appreciated. We have a couple questions in the chat. I wanted to take one from Michael, really talking again kind of about the next generation. And I think, his point is really, I think, the next generation we kind of see as having a little bit more awareness of mental health and practicing that. So his question is, we must keep them away from habits that are detrimental. How do you go about doing that? And do you find that is kind of true for the younger attorneys?
What we know and what studies are showing is there massively different attitudes for the different generations that are in the workforce right now. And the younger generations, they have probably themselves experienced depression or anxiety. If you look at the statistics, they certainly do know multiple people that have experienced this, and they're so much more willing to talk about it. There's not that stigma that's attached. And so in the short term, if these people are going into an office where they're subject to the rules, et cetera, they may not be able to make a lot of impact there. I will say that all of these efforts around promoting well-being in law, it's going to happen because those people who really care about this and prioritize it above, for example, compensation, they will be in leadership positions. So the hope and the prayer is that they will continue to have those sort of attitudes. I don't know, I bet Patrick's got some things to add too.
And I hope so. I think that's right too. I really hope so. I hope that they're not kind of co-opted by the machine and by the norms, because it would be great to see that cultural change truly take hold in an authentic and durable way, where the profession, 10, 15 years down the road just didn't look the same as it relates to not only the prevalence of mental health and problem drinking issues, but also the way that we approach them and the stigma that attached to them. I would say, again, thank you for the great question. The one thing that all of us can do if we want to keep that new or younger generation from adopting some of those problematic coping mechanisms and behaviors is look at what are we modeling, right? And are we doing things, what kind of signals are we sending? Because if you're someone who's more established in the profession, you're more senior, you're kind of already doing the work, they're looking to you. And they're going to, even though they do have these different and more enlightened attitudes around mental health, they're still going to be looking to you and the kind of cues that you are offering. And so I think all of us need to look at our own behaviors on a day in, day out basis. And this is hard to do. Sometimes we don't want to acknowledge the results that this inquiry yields, but say, how does my action impact the well-being of those around me, right? How is the way that I'm bringing myself to work impacting the mental health and well-being of those around me? And sometimes we need to make some slight shifts or adjustments if we want to feel good about the answer that generates.
Thank you. And I also wanted to ask a question that Edward has as well, that I think kind of gets into some of the data you talked about, Patrick and Bree, a bit. Have stress levels increased post-pandemic, and as a result, are emails replacing direct phone calls? And our add to this too, I mean, I definitely hear, right, that there are less people coming to bar association meetings, and this, I know, Bree, gets into your loneliness. So I guess for you, Bree, how does this kind of touch on that? And then Patrick, for you, really kind of talking about what your data showed with post-pandemic or during pandemic.
Yeah. I think that there is with all of that, and we're just glued to our screens and our devices at this time, the loneliness that we have been experiencing in our profession, and the Harvard Business Review found that lawyers were the loneliest profession back in 2018, just really feeds into that and escalates the isolation, which causes a whole host of problems. So, yeah.
Yeah. So, I mean, to the point about emails and phone calls, I'm so tired of emails, right? And I think we probably all are. I've started recently picking up the phone and calling my clients. You don't often get them, right? And you often get voicemail, but I'm really trying to the best of my ability, because you can also have a 5-minute phone call that covers everything that would have been covered in a series of 20 emails back and forth. It's far more efficient. And it also provides that little bit of human connection, right? You hear the person's voice, maybe you chat for just a minute or two about life. And so I would encourage all of us to try and get back to that, because keeping up with the volume of emails that we all have is a stressor in and of itself. And, just picking up the phone call, more efficient, going to get more done, going to maintain that human connection. Because in terms of what the data shows us, stress levels continue to be through the roof. The data that are beginning to trickle in post-pandemic, kind of in the society as a whole, suggest mental health has not improved. We've made it through that period when all the levels of mental health distress shot through the roof. And it appears to be that we're still in this place where people are burned out, and they're very stressed, and they're not necessarily feeling good.
For sure. I also wanted to ask, I think Sarah has a great question, that kind of turns, we talked about what lawyers can do, but what are some of the, best practices for how firms can help lawyers feel, happier, more satisfied in their, jobs, and protects them from some of these issues?
How firms can help lawyers feel happy in their jobs in a way that protects them from these problems. Well, that's a big question, right? And I think part of it would depend. It's a good question. It's a big question, though. I think part of it would depend on the firm and what kind of the existing culture there is, because those cultures can vary greatly. And you could have two firms that even on paper look comparable, but inside the firm, it's just a different feeling. It's a different culture. It's a different level of collegiality or lack thereof. But I would say one thing to think about, and this is based on another study that I published in 2022, where we examined the connection between what lawyers feel valued for and their mental health, their physical health, as well as their risk of attrition. And we found that when lawyers feel primarily valued for their productivity, billable hours, or responsiveness, they have the worst mental health, the worst physical health, compared to lawyers who are feeling valued for their skill, their professionalism, their talent, their inherent worth as a human being. And so, make people feel seen and appreciated and recognized for something other than how many hours they billed, how much business they brought in, how quickly they responded to that email, right? Make them feel seen and appreciated for just doing good work, being a good lawyer, being a good person, right? Because we clearly saw that translates into better outcomes across all the metrics we looked at. And I think that makes sense, right? People want to feel like they matter, and they want to feel like their effort matters, and they don't want to feel like they're just kind of a fungible unit of productivity. None of us.
Yeah, and I think just one of the things we know is that when people have meaningful work, that gets into the not feeling like they're just a cog in the wheel or they're just completely ignored. That can really help to boost well-being. And I think just some practices for management in general. We heard this during COVID, and it's still the case. Communicate, communicate, communicate with your people regularly and one-on-one or in group. Get the leadership of the firm to communicate and reinforce the vital importance of well-being and taking care of yourself just for that reason, but it's also around productivity and profitability as well. Being willing to do things like give real transparency around the compensation process and what that looks like. What are you going to be graded upon, so to speak? Those are some of the things, just sort of institute some of these strategies that can really start to move the dial.
Well, those are great. And I guess to add on to that question, do you find that there would be differences for, big firms versus small firms, solos? Because we have a lot of different people practicing in different areas. What are your thoughts on that?
It's very different for solo and small firms. Absolutely. And I'll just say I had my own law practice for 54 weeks. It's the toughest job I ever had. I counted the weeks, as you can tell. And for me, it was the isolation and lack of being connected to a group that had, a mission. And so, there is the isolation piece that can really crop up in that. I think that bar associations have a real role here in providing support. I can tell you that for particularly younger solo practitioners, law practice management fits directly into well-being, because I work with so many lawyers who were absolutely overwhelmed with their cases, but also just trying to figure out how to manage an office and keep the doors open. And that added stressor, it could just become overwhelming and everything starts to fall down. It's sad to hear that attendance at events are decreasing. I hope that changes, because that's an opportunity to come together. And that's vitally important. Yeah. Patrick, do you have some other thoughts about those differences?
The differences between large and small firms as it relates to things that can be done. Well, I would say that generally speaking, larger firms have more resources available, right? Economies of scale and those types of things, where they're able to maybe have better benefits, frankly, more robust medical and mental health benefits. And someone in a smaller firm might not have access to those things. But what they might have access to is a better culture and people that actually know them and would notice if they're not feeling great or if they're not in a good place. And so I think, looking for what your firm or organization has and kind of leaning into those strengths and saying, how can we leverage this in service of improved mental health and well-being, right? So if you're a smaller solo firm, not solo firm, but if you're a small firm, making sure that those people are staying tightly connected and that you're really getting the full benefit of that smaller kind of cultural fit and feel that people in a larger environment might not be taking advantage of. I agree with Bree about the role of bar associations here, because there aren't enough resources out there that are accessible to organizations, smaller organizations that might not have the budget or resources for the latest benefits, apps, services, et cetera. And I really would like to see more done in that realm, getting creative about how can we bring better resources to the majority of the profession. Overwhelming majority of the profession is not practicing in large firms.
Right. No, those are great. Thank you. I wanted to go to Samantha's question, because I think it gets to the heart of the matter that we sometimes hear. So you hear this work-life balance, going back to that term, let's just say well-being, that well-being is important, but it's implied that you should do this, so long as your productivity isn't affected. What would you say to that?
The first thing that comes to my mind is that those well-being activities to promote that are going to help your productivity. Just like Patrick referenced earlier, get up from your desk and walk around the block if you can. That is going to give you just a moment of rest and to be able to reset, come back and be refreshed and be more productive than if you just gut it out and sit at your desk for 4 hours or so at a time.
Yeah, I agree with that. And I also agree that the conversation does also feel hollow. I've been hearing that for years, right? I go into a firm and I'm addressing its associates, and they are interested in the subject matter, but you can tell that a lot of them are very skeptical. They feel like it's window dressing, that the actual demands are not changing. And therefore, the suggestion that we're focused on well-being doesn't align with their daily lived experience, right? And I get that. I think that we need to find a better way to synthesize the two goals of having. I mean, businesses need to be productive, right? Law firms, even if you're a solo, maybe especially if you're a solo practice, you need to be productive, right? We all have to keep the lights on, pay bills, reach our financial objectives, but we also have to take care of ourselves. And these really shouldn't be mutually exclusive, or to think that if you're really going to take care of yourself and focus on well-being, that it always has to be subordinate to productivity. We've got a lot of work to do. We've got a lot of creative thinking that remains, to be done about how we better synthesize those two objectives, those two very important outcomes. But I would just say it does often feel hollow, and that's not just your perception.
Right. What would you say is the potential impact on law firms and the legal profession as a whole if we, keep pushing attorneys and really fail to pay attention to a lot of the data we've talked about today, and other data that's out there?
Yeah, a lot of attrition, and particularly, we seem to have gotten over some of the crisis of a tremendous amount of attrition, but we can talk about unwanted attrition. We have a study that Patrick did showed that women are 25% of women in this study are considering leaving the profession, not just their job, but their profession, due to behavioral health concerns. And that should be a huge wake-up call for everyone, because I've been a lawyer for 35 years, and all that time I've worked on issues around equity for women. And we're here. Not only do we still have far to go on that, but we're looking at potentially starting to backslide. And that's really tremendously worrisome. Patrick.
Yeah, I agree with that, Bree. We do seem to be moving in the wrong direction, or at least threatening to move in the wrong direction as it relates to that goal specifically, and just to, reaching some of the goals and targets that we have for the profession. But in addition to the attrition issue, which is very real, I think we also have to be looking at, what kind of profession we want to be leaving for future generations. Going back to that question earlier about what would you tell someone in law school, or someone who's thinking about going to law school? I think it's incumbent upon all of us to ask ourselves, are we in this solely for ourselves? Or do we want to maybe feel like we're leaving this a little bit better than we found it? It's a common complaint, especially in corporate law environments. People don't feel like there's a lot of meaning and purpose in their work, right? They're not doing a lot of client interaction. They're not necessarily feeling like their work has a lot of societal value. But to the extent that that's true, people might be able to derive some meaning and value by knowing that they're making their chosen profession a little bit better. They're leaving it a little bit better than they would have otherwise if they just kind of continue to propagate a lot of the problematic norms, behaviors, and attitudes that have gotten us to this place. And so I think it's an invitation for people to really look at themselves and say, okay, this is what I did with my career. How do I want to leave it? How do I want to, be known in my role as an attorney, and to engage in a little bit of introspection about that.
And I think for law firms, just to get to the real nitty gritty here, law firms are leaving money on the table. There is a strong case that research has shown consistently over and over that when you have a mentally healthy workforce, you are going to be more profitable. You are going to attract and retain clients better. You're going to have a workforce that is more productive. And so it is a financial loss when firms don't pay attention to this. So we always want to mention that, because if nothing else, you go from Patrick's very, idealism there, which I totally agree with. But then let's just get down to the brass tacks, which is about, for many, is about money.
It's good for business. I'm so glad you said that, Bree, because it's good for business. And I think people need to recognize that. Maybe they don't really care, but they probably do care about the health of their business. And focusing on mental health and well-being is a good way to enhance that.
Great. I think Anne makes a good comment, kind of question that I, was thinking about as well. It's, I think for lawyers, we are really in the business of caretaking, right? And what evidence, we want the evidence, right? I know you guys have alluded to it. What's the evidence that if we, take care of ourselves, it's going to help us, in the long run?
Yeah. Patrick, do you have any studies off the top of your head?
If we take care of ourselves, it's going to help us in the long run. I guess I'm not.
Right. Like just how do we know for sure that, right, that taking care of ourselves really, does help us work, more productively and it's worth the time to do it.
Yeah, I would encourage everyone, everyone listening to this conversation is presumably a professional adult, right? Think about your own life and your own experience, and think about times when you've been stretched thin, overburdened, burned out, or flirting with burnout, just not in a good place. How much patience have you had? How much energy have you had to go help someone? Or, how irritable have you been? How has your focus been? Right? There's a lot of research on the cognitive impact of mental health problems, right? Depression, anxiety, these things can significantly interfere with our cognitive abilities, not to mention the obvious kind of mood and attitudinal disturbances that they can bring. And so I think if you just kind of reflect on your own experience, that when you're feeling pretty good, maybe you've had a few nights good sleep, you're just kind of somewhat rested, you're not overburdened or burnt out, you're going to be more focused. You're going to be more energetic. You're going to be less pessimistic, less cynical, and you're probably going to have a little bit more patience for people and events that come at you throughout the day. So I guess I'll just conclude by saying, we have plenty of research that shows the cognitive impacts of mental health problems, but you can also just think about your lived experience, and I think the dots begin to connect themselves.
For sure. And Miriam asked an interesting question to kind of bring it back a little bit to the start of one's career. She asks, what's the responsibility that law schools should or do have regarding attorney well-being?
Yeah, and there's increasingly more and more attention being paid to this area of what is the role of law schools, and there is a significant one. One of those is to not sort of dump into the legal profession law students and brand new minted attorneys that are already experiencing significant behavioral health issues. And the legal educational system that we have now, again, there is research that shows that each year there is elevation of distress, that some of the practices that you're seeing in the law schools, and we've all experienced them, the way that people, the Socratic method, hyper competitiveness, all of these things really do start to take just like a drip effect of wearing the resilience and the capacity of these law students down, so that by the time they walk into the door of their first job, they're already have been negatively impacted. And so, I have taught at a law school before, and I was not tenured, to try and get tenured track professors to change the way they teach. Very difficult. It's a multi-layered problem. Making sure that law schools also talk about this. everybody has to take a professional responsibility course. So weave this into mandatory courses. Have you run across other ideas, Patrick?
Well, I think everything you said is correct, obviously. But the one point that I would add in terms of law schools focusing more on this, they need to do a lot more too. And I'll just say that. I think that they are underperforming in terms of their efforts to address mental health and well-being. And part of that is driven, in my view, by the fact that law schools are very cautious about dissuading people from entering law school, right? They're businesses as well, and they need people to enroll in order for that business to sustain itself. And so I think that has fed into some reluctance on the part of law schools to really embrace this issue as being as pressing as it is, and to be transparent in their efforts to address it. I can't tell you how many lawyers I've counseled or worked with or spoken to over the years who told me that their drinking really took off in law school, right? Like that was when a lot of their unhealthy behaviors really took hold and then carried with them throughout the next 10, 20 years of their practice until they finally reached a crisis point and they had to address them. And so I would like to see law schools do a lot more. And I'm confident that they can do a lot more in a more direct and transparent way without discouraging people from coming to law school. I think that's a needle that can be threaded.
For sure. Thank you. Laura asks a good question regarding trauma, which I think is more of a topic that's coming up, and people are recognizing that, lawyers and judges help people really at the worst times, in their lives. And so, they experience, a lot of traumas involved. So how can lawyers and judges really separate themselves from that trauma they experience at work?
Yeah, and I spent years working in the area of domestic violence and child abuse. So trauma. And some of it gets down to being aware simply that this is traumatic for yourself, not just your clients, but for you. And it's the ongoing exposure to these events and evidence that is outside the normal course of what a human being should have to be exposed to or endure. And so that's sort of the source of the trauma there. Some of the things that I did, and I've heard advice since then, is figuring out a way to truly end your day, to create that boundary. It can be, when you shut your car door, that's the end of it. Or you get up from your computer at the end of the day and you have some routine that signals to you you're done. And now you have an opportunity for rest and rejuvenation. And that's a piece of it. I can tell you, when I was doing this work in the 90s and the aughts, I didn't have a sense that this trauma was actually impacting my own mental health. So having that awareness, monitoring yourself, checking in with yourself and sort of doing a self-assessment. How am I holding up? Am I changing who I am? Am I changing the way that I interact with the people in my lives? And if that starts to occur, you may be entering a stage of burnout, and be willing to ask for help. There's a lot of stigma around this, less and less, but know yourself and know when you need to ask for help.
I agree with all of that. And it's such good timing, the sequence of these last two questions, right? Because the fact that so many practitioners, judges do encounter trauma or really difficult, maybe they're encountering the types of things that Bree was describing, domestic violence, child abuse, maybe they're in the criminal justice system and see everything that's involved there. I mean, what an opportunity for law schools to step up to the plate and better prepare people for these real risks that they are likely to encounter in their career. That's not happening outside of maybe a few isolated examples. And so, I think that's a way that you could incorporate a much greater focus on mental health into the law school curriculum without, for example, saying, that we're doing this because this career is statistically likely to cause you some mental health distress. It's just better equipping people with information so that they have that awareness that Bree's mentioning. They know this work I'm doing is probably going to impact me if I don't mitigate some of this stuff that I'm being exposed to and some of these pressures that I'm experiencing.
One of the things I've advocated for is in clinical programs in law school, you're actually having students go out and represent people. Build a piece of the curriculum is to cover, secondary trauma and the effects and how to identify it and how to protect yourself from it.
Excellent. I wanted to also just bring up Kathy's point and question. We haven't really talked too much about it, but obviously we're all, working from home more, whether we're back in the office, but a lot of us are hybrid. And so how is, that affecting one's well-being, and how can we kind of address that so that we don't, adopt some of these coping mechanisms?
Well, it's a great question, and I'm glad that you raised that, Kathy, because I think the first step is simply for people to acknowledge it, right? Recognize it, as the saying goes, name it to tame it, right? Recognize I'm not really connecting with people the way I used to. Maybe I am feeling a little bit lonely, right? Loneliness, we tend to stigmatize it even in ourselves, right? And so just being able to recognize that, admit it. And then what I would say beyond there is that the key is structure, right? Actually taking a structured approach to solving this problem. Put it on your calendar, put it in your Outlook, whatever you need to do, right? That I'm going to check in with someone, I'm going to schedule a call, I'm going to hold myself accountable to having this human interaction, which it sounds oddly robotic to have to, schedule your human interaction, but sometimes we do. And especially if you're working from home all the time, realize that you might be experiencing a loss of connection that you're not even realizing at first. And then you will begin to realize it, and it could hit you all at once.
And a footnote to that is that the legal profession is full of introverts. And so sometimes that can be even more difficult, but introverts need people too, maybe not as often as extroverts. And so again, I'm an introvert, and I've actually done that where I schedule, I don't necessarily feel like it at the time, but I will schedule and get on my calendar calls or coffees with people, because I know some of the medicine that I need for my well-being is to have this one-on-one, face-to-face human connection.
Sure. You both briefly mentioned before that we're kind of at a critical point in the profession as to, things are getting a little bit worse on the well-being front. What are, some very practical things that, people can take away from this discussion today?
I think it's a starting place for yourself is, and something I always talk about, it's basic, but foundational, is to have self-awareness around when you start to slip down on sort of the scale of well-being, and be willing to take some action to address that. A lot of times it may be therapy, and that can be a great thing to do. It takes some time, but it is increasingly more and more available. We're seeing law firms really start to, some of them bend over backwards to make sure that that resource is available to their people. And be willing to access resources. And I always have to say at this juncture to everybody to remember there's a lawyer's assistance program, which is confidential in every state. It's confidential. You can seek access and get advice anonymously. So remember that as well. If some people have hesitancy to contact, say, their employer's insurance or EAP.
Sure.
Yeah.
Excellent. Patrick, do you have any additional things to add to that?
I would encourage everyone to really prioritize some breaks and downtime in their lives. And for some people that might feel impractical, especially if you're, a solo practitioner and you don't feel like you have the backup or the support. I know that can be difficult, right? Or maybe you're in a large firm and you feel like your billable hour targets are such that you can't take that time away. But I think really doing your best to prioritize it, recognize the need, right? Even machines need to be taken offline occasionally to be serviced, right? And we're human beings. We have a need for some downtime, for some rest, for some restoration, for some connection with other human beings. And I would just encourage everyone to keep that top of mind. And then the final thing I'll say is that we've been focused on mental health and well-being and having this more robust conversation now for about 8 or 9 years. And to some people, it may have started to seem like background noise, right? Because we've been talking about this, but has anything really changed? And I would say that this is the time to redouble our efforts and to actually recommit ourselves to this, because we are experiencing, I would say, unsustainable levels of mental health distress. And you have too many people who are drinking at levels that are shortening their lifespans and, you know, harming their health. And there's a lot more work to be done. And I would just encourage us all to stay engaged with it.
Thank you. That's a great way to close. Thank you so much, both for the work you do in this area and for being here, and really the discussion on a topic that's really important for the effectiveness of this profession.